A low, persistent drone, akin to distant thunder that refused to cease, began before daylight. In Weymouth, a market town nestled in Dorset, Mary Richards, aged 42, drew back her blackout drapes. What met her gaze was a spectacle resembling the entirety of the American armed forces, cascading down the main thoroughfare. A ceaseless stream of trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, and tanks, an unending river of olive-drab steel and men, flowed for 3 consecutive days. "Good heavens," she murmured, "there must be thousands of them." Indeed, there were. By the early part of 1944, 1.5 million American servicemen had already disembarked in Britain. Their presence became ubiquitous, infiltrating pubs, occupying street corners, filling cinemas, and transforming sleepy market towns into locales that felt more akin to Texas than England. For the British populace, who had endured 4 years of stringent rationing, relentless bombing raids, and stark austerity, the arrival of the Americans was akin to a portal opening to an entirely different existence. A more boisterous existence, a more affluent existence, one characterized by the constant chewing of gum and the adoption of accents heard in motion pictures. The sentiments expressed by the British regarding this influx were nuanced, their true feelings a complex tapestry. The initial preparations for this massive undertaking commenced in 1942 with Operation Bolero, the designated code name for the substantial redeployment of American forces across the Atlantic. However, it was during the concluding months of 1943 and the initial period of 1944 that the American presence reached an overwhelming, unignorable magnitude. Southern England was irrevocably reshaped into a colossal military encampment. From Devon to Dorset, Hampshire to Cornwall, and across East Anglia, Americans were a constant sight. The British government had endeavored to prepare both sides for this cultural exchange. American personnel arriving in Britain were issued a booklet titled "A Short Guide to Great Britain," cautioning them that the British were reserved, had been engaged in solitary combat for years, considered tea a matter of grave importance, and that British beer was served warm, discouraging ostentation and boasting. The British, in contrast, received little preparation beyond the Americans themselves. "Ready or not, they're so tall," quickly became a common observation, attributing this height to superior nutrition or distinct genetics. American soldiers appeared to dwarf their British counterparts. Furthermore, women noted their remarkable cleanliness. Their uniforms were newer, better fitted, and their boots gleamed. Everything about the Americans seemed more abundant, more polished, more refined. Yet it was when they began to speak that the true cultural dislocation became apparent. "Hiya, sweetheart," was the greeting that British women encountered dozens of times daily, a far cry from the polite "Good morning, miss," or a simple nod. This immediate, casual familiarity was perceived as simultaneously charming and presumptuous. They addressed everyone as buddy or pal. Their gait was often a slouch, hands stuffed into pockets. The persistent chewing of gum, their jaws working like ruminating cattle, was a constant. Within the pubs, they were notably loud, their laughter echoing and backs being heartily slapped, often occupying twice the space a British soldier would. A phrase soon emerged, spreading through Britain like an inside joke that everyone felt compelled to share. "The trouble with the Yanks is they're overpaid, oversexed, and overhar." Its humor stemmed from its perceived accuracy, at least in the estimation of many British civilians and soldiers. An American private earned approximately $50 per month, equivalent to about £12. A British private, however, received £2 per week, roughly £10 per month. The Americans possessed over 5 times the disposable income, a disparity evident in their actions. They readily bought rounds of drinks at the pub without hesitation. They treated young women to meals at establishments far beyond the financial reach of British soldiers. They had access to chocolate, to cigarettes, and to nylon stockings that had vanished from British shops years prior. Naturally, the Americans had their own rejoinder. The British are underpaid, undersexed, and under Eisenhower. Beneath the surface of these jests, however, genuine tensions simmered. In the pubs of Southampton, British soldiers on leave observed American GIS purchasing drinks for British women, a sight that stoked their resentment. These were men who had been fighting since 1939, who had survived the harrowing ordeal of Dunkirk, the North African campaigns, and the perilous Atlantic convoys, only to return home and find their companions dancing with newly arrived Americans, who exuded an air of freshness, affluence, and self-assurance. Fights erupted, necessitating patrols by military police from both nations, working in pairs to maintain order. "They treat our women like they're for sale," one British corporal confided to a mass observation interviewer in early 1944. The Mass Observation Project, a British social research organization, had been diligently collecting civilian diaries and conducting surveys since before the war. Their archives preserved unfiltered accounts, capturing sentiments beyond official pronouncements and patriotic newspaper reports. And these accounts revealed a mixed perspective. Yes, resentment existed. Yes, there were altercations, tensions, and cultural misinterpretations that occasionally escalated into unpleasantness. Yet, something else was also evident, particularly in the observations of women and children. "They're so generous," remarked a shopkeeper in Dorchester. "Almost embarrassingly so. An American soldier will buy sweets for every child in the shop. Just hand them out like Father Christmas. British soldiers can't do that. They simply don't have the money." The children were quick to notice. Within weeks of the Americans' arrival, British youngsters had mastered the magical phrase, "Got any gum, chum?" They would trail American soldiers down the street, a procession of hopeful faces. The Americans, many of whom were themselves barely out of their teens, rarely disappointed. Packs of Wrigley's spearmint gum, Hershey's chocolate bars, and an array of candies that British children had not encountered in years became commonplace. The Americans seemed to possess an inexhaustible supply. "My daughter came home with chocolate 3 times last week," a mother in Plymouth confided to her diary. "She's never had so many sweets in her life. I should probably stop her from begging. But God, when did we last have chocolate? And they give it so freely, as if it's nothing." And indeed, to them, it was nothing. The Americans had access to PX stores, their private emporiums stocked with goods that were rationed or entirely unavailable to British civilians. Cigarettes by the carton, chocolate by the pound, tinned provisions, coffee, soap, razor blades, all the items that the British had been doing without. This fostered its own unique economy. British women who socialized with American soldiers suddenly found themselves with an abundance of stockings, lipstick, and perfume. Some women engaged in more direct exchanges, bartering companionship for goods in transactions that ranged from innocent to desperate to purely commercial. The term "good time girls" entered the vernacular, and local authorities expressed concern regarding both public morality and the rising rates of venereal disease. However, many of the relationships were built on genuine affection. By the war's conclusion, approximately 70,000 British women would marry American servicemen, becoming GI brides, who would subsequently immigrate to America. The reactions from their families varied dramatically. "My father won't speak to me," one young woman from Devon wrote to her sister. "Says I'm abandoning England for a Yank who will probably dump me once he gets home. But Jim's not like that. He's from Iowa. He wants to take me home to meet his mother. Father just can't see past the uniform." Conversely, other families welcomed the Americans, extending invitations for tea, for Sunday dinner, and striving to alleviate their homesickness. In the quaint villages scattered across southern England, American soldiers became temporary members of British households, sending home accounts of their hosts' kindness, the peculiar cuisine, the warm beer, and the endless cups of tea. The cultural divergences cut both ways. British civilians found the Americans utterly perplexing. Why did they insist on putting ice in everything? Why did they talk so incessantly? Why couldn't they grasp the concept of orderly queuing rather than simply pushing to the front? Why did they lament that British beer was warm, when that was precisely how it was intended to be served? Then there was the issue of race, a subject that British civilians found particularly difficult to comprehend. The American military operated under a system of segregation. Black soldiers served in distinct units, dined in separate mess halls, and were often relegated to support roles rather than direct combat. Upon their arrival in Britain, American commanders expected British establishments to uphold this segregationist policy. They requested that publicans designate specific evenings for white soldiers and separate evenings for black soldiers. They also asked that black soldiers be served in different sections of their establishments. Many British civilians refused to comply. While Britain certainly had its own racial prejudices, formal segregation was not an ingrained part of its cultural fabric. Some publicans informed American officers that all were welcome within their establishments, asserting that they would not turn away any soldier fighting Hitler. When white American military police attempted to enforce segregation in British towns, local civilians sometimes intervened. "I saw 3 American MPs dragging a colored soldier out of a pub in Bamber Bridge," a man from Lancashire recorded. The publican came out, shouting that the lad had done nothing wrong, that he was welcome in his pub. More locals gathered. It got ugly. "The Americans don't understand that we don't do things their way here." The incident in Bamber Bridge in June of 1943 tragically escalated into a shooting, resulting in the death of 1 black soldier and injuries to others. This violence, stemming from what appeared to the British fundamentally unjust, deeply shocked the local population. These were, however, the intricate complexities that accompanied the hosting of an army comprising 1.5 million foreigners. Each day brought its own minor frictions, cultural collisions, and misunderstandings that required careful navigation. In East Anglia, where the American 8th Air Force established its bomber bases, entire villages found themselves living in close proximity to airfields. The thunderous roar of B-17s and B-24s taking off on missions became the ubiquitous soundtrack to daily existence. Villagers would watch the bombers depart at dawn, meticulously count them upon their return in the afternoon, and invariably notice the gaps in their formations. "You learn not to get too friendly," observed a woman from Suffolk. "You see the same faces in the pub for weeks. Then suddenly they're gone. You know what that means? You see it in the other boys' faces. Someone didn't come back." The Americans brought their vibrant culture with them. Glenn Miller and his Army Air Force Band performed extensively throughout Britain. American films were screened in local cinemas. Dances were organized, typically with 5 British women for every American soldier, necessitating carefully managed rotation systems and time limits per dance. British girls enthusiastically embraced the jitterbug, a style of dancing that appeared wild and somewhat immodest to the eyes of older Britons. "They throw the girls around like rag dolls," one disapproving father commented. "All this American jazz music and carrying on, it's not decent." But the girls reveled in it. After years of war, of darkness, rationing, and constant worry, the Americans injected an infusion of energy, excitement, and possibility. They possessed a confidence that British men either lacked or were unable to exhibit after prolonged periods of grueling warfare. They spoke of the future, of America, of lives that seemed impossibly abundant from the perspective of wartime Britain. "He told me about his family's farm in Nebraska," a young woman from Hampshire wrote. "They have 3 cars, 3, and electricity in every room, and a refrigerator the size of a wardrobe." She couldn't ascertain if he was exaggerating, but he seemed to consider it perfectly normal. To the Americans, it was, indeed, normal. They hailed from a country that had not experienced aerial bombardment, where food was not rationed, and where one could leave their lights on at night. The stark contrast with Britain's wartime austerity was palpable and reflected in every facet of their conduct. Some British civilians appreciated this glimpse of abundance. Others found it ostentatious, this casual display of wealth while Britain was bleeding. The resentment was particularly acute among British soldiers who had been fighting since 1939, who had endured years of combat, and who returned to find Americans, mere newcomers, being hailed as heroes. "We held the line alone for 2 years, one British sergeant remarked bitterly. "Where were they then? Now they show up with their money and their chocolate and their big talk about winning the war, and everyone acts like they're saviors." It was perhaps unfair, but the sentiment was deeply felt. The Americans had arrived late to the war. That was an undeniable fact. Britain had stood defiantly against Hitler alone from June of 1940 to June of 1941. It had weathered the Blitz, fought in North Africa, the Atlantic, and the Mediterranean, all while America remained neutral. While gratitude for America's eventual entry into the conflict was genuine, so too was the underlying resentment regarding the protracted delay. Nevertheless, by early 1944, the majority of British civilians had come to accept the American presence as an indispensable necessity. Regardless of the cultural frictions or personal resentments, everyone understood the overarching objective of those 1.5 million men. The invasion was imminent. Everyone was aware of it. Even if unspoken, the Americans were congregating in southern England with the clear intention of crossing the English Channel and fighting their way into France. In December of 1943, the reality of what was approaching became impossible to ignore. In a specific region of Devon, the British government mandated the evacuation of the South Hams area surrounding Slapton Sands. 3,000 civilians were given mere weeks to vacate their homes, their farms, and their businesses. The Americans required the area for amphibious landing practice, as the beaches bore a striking resemblance to those of Normandy, necessitating realistic training conditions. "They came to our door on December 4th, one evacuee recalled. "We were told we had to be out by December 20th. Christmas was approaching, and they were telling us to leave our homes." Some families had been cultivating their land for generations, but it was deemed essential for the war effort for the impending invasion. The displaced civilians dispersed among relatives, into temporary housing, and to whatever arrangements they could secure. The Americans assumed control of their villages and commenced their training for D-Day. In April of 1944, Exercise Tiger concluded in disaster when German E-boats attacked the practice convoy, resulting in the deaths of over 700 American servicemen. The evacuated British civilians were aware that something significant had transpired. They observed the heightened security, the ambulances, and the somber expressions of the personnel involved, but the specifics remained classified. By May of 1944, southern England had been transformed into a colossal armed encampment. The roads teemed with military convoys. Tanks, trucks, and jeeps occupied every available inch of space. In ports and harbors, landing craft amassed in numbers that made any attempt at concealment futile. The civilian population watched and waited, their knowledge growing. "You couldn't miss it," a woman from Portsmouth reminisced. "The sheer scale of it. Every road, every field, every port." The cacophony was incessant. The drone of engines, shouted orders, the clatter of equipment being loaded. We knew they were leaving soon. You could feel it. The Americans themselves seemed to sense the impending departure. The boisterousness in the pubs diminished. The jokes grew more strained. They penned lengthy letters home, imbued with a sense of finality, often referred to as just-in-case letters. They distributed possessions they would no longer require, mementos for their British friends, their addresses in America, and promises to maintain correspondence. British civilians who had spent months voicing complaints about the Americans suddenly found their perspectives shifting. These boisterous, generous, and at times exasperating foreigners were on the verge of sailing across the Channel to engage in combat. Many of them, it was understood, would not return. "I saw a group of them in Weymouth the night before they left," a local shopkeeper remembered. Young lads, most of them, barely 20. They were trying to be cheerful, singing songs, but you could see the fear. They knew what was coming. We all did. On the night of June 5, 1944, the convoys began their inexorable movement towards the ports. The sound was immense, overwhelming, the rumble of thousands of vehicles traversing the darkness. British civilians stood in their doorways or peered from their windows, bearing witness to history in motion. "The whole street came out," a woman from Southampton recorded. "Just stood there in the dark, watching them go. Some people were crying. The soldiers waved, tried to smile. One boy, couldn't have been more than 19, shouted, 'See you later, love,' to my daughter. She waved back, tears running down her face. We never saw him again, never knew his name." The following morning, June 6th, the BBC announced the commencement of the invasion. Allied forces had successfully landed in Normandy. The Americans, who had thronged British streets for months, who had reshaped towns and villages, who had distributed chocolate to children and danced with British girls, who had engaged in pub brawls, practiced their landings, and waited with bated breath, were now on French beaches, fighting and perishing to liberate Europe. British civilians absorbed the news with a complex amalgam of emotions. Relief that the invasion had finally begun, anxiety regarding its outcome, gratitude for the sacrifices being made, and perhaps, for some, a pang of guilt concerning the resentments they had harbored, the complaints they had voiced about these very men who were now bleeding on the beaches of Normandy. "We called them overpaid and oversexed," one British woman reflected years later. "We complained about their manners and their money and their success with our girls. But they came here, far from home, to fight a war that wasn't originally theirs. And thousands of them died doing it. I think about that boy who gave my son chocolate every time he saw him. I think about all of them, really. The noise they made, the life they brought, even the problems. And then how quiet it was after they left. The American presence in Britain did not cease with D-Day. Troops continued to arrive. Casualties were transported back for treatment, and the air bases in East Anglia continued to conduct missions. However, the immense concentration of forces in southern England began to disperse. The streets were no longer quite as congested. The pubs grew quieter. Children had fewer soldiers from whom to solicit sweets. In the South Hams, evacuated civilians were eventually permitted to return to their homes, though this occurred months after D-Day. They discovered their villages ravaged by the training exercises, their farms overgrown, and their homes battered by the elements and neglect. The Americans left behind Nissen huts and spent shell casings, and the spectral presence of 700 men who perished during Exercise Tiger. Across Britain, the Americans left other indelible marks. British women found themselves pregnant with American babies, some abandoned, others awaiting the return of their soldiers for marriage. Children who had adopted American speech patterns and the habit of chewing gum. Publicans who had profited significantly, and others whose establishments had been damaged. Families who had offered solace to lonely American boys, providing them a semblance of home. Women who had fallen in love and were soon to embark on voyages to America to begin new lives. And memories, complicated memories of a complex era. They were impossible, really, one British veteran reflected decades later. Loud and brash and far too sure of themselves. But God, they were brave and generous. And most of them were just kids, far from home, scared, but trying not to show it. We gave them a hard time, and they gave us a hard time back. And somehow we muddled through together. That's what I remember most. Not the fights or the resentments, but the muddling through, the shared cigarettes and the terrible jokes, and the understanding underneath it all that we were in this together. This sentiment perhaps encapsulates the most truthful observation made by British civilians about the Americans who flooded their streets in the lead-up to D-Day. Beyond the jests about being overpaid and oversexed, beyond the complaints concerning their manners, their money, or their morals, lay a recognition, sometimes grudging but always genuine, that these foreigners had arrived to help conclude a war that Britain could not win alone. The Americans brought their wealth, their confidence, and their cultural differences, and yes, their challenges. But they also brought something invaluable: hope. The hope that the invasion would succeed, that the war would end, and that life might eventually return to a semblance of normalcy. In the somber spring of 1944, after years of war, of loss, and of unyielding endurance, that hope was worth more than all the chocolate, cigarettes, and nylon stockings combined. British civilians observed the Americans filling their streets, and their pronouncements were indeed complex. Yet what they felt beneath the veneer of jokes, complaints, and cultural confusion was perhaps simpler. They felt that the tide had turned, that the end was approaching, and that these loud, generous, and in many ways impossible Americans were going to help them achieve victory. And on the beaches of Normandy, that is precisely what they did.